Firm of Bowen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, we have a city of oaks. California has a city called Oakland. The Pelicans will be flying between both as the surprising underdogs take on the defending world champs in the second round of the NBA playoffs. Back home, a new city administration prepares to take the court. And among the many questions are the status of the monuments, developing unused city property, and filling key administrative positions. We'll look at all of that, as well as questions of jury votes and criminal terms, and also a job-intensive chemical plant for the region. Starting for us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Gordon Russell, managing editor for Investigations, The New Orleans Advocate; Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist; and Kevin Litton, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. I'm going to go over to Gordon first. And you did a piece about a week or so ago taking a look at sentencing in Louisiana and folks who have long prison terms, maybe more so than in other states for the same type of offenses, and how all this is linked to, our criminal justice reform, and taking a look at juror votes too. So we'll just kind of go one by one on that. What did you find on the sentencing?
Well, so we were looking at how Louisiana is one of two states that allows for non-unanimous jury verdicts in felony cases. Right. Oregon is the other. And we were looking at how this ties together, or how this might be linked to our status as the most incarcerating state in the country, and in fact in the world. And so what we found was that there's sort of a nexus between, we have generally very stiff sentencing laws, we have this punitive habitual offender law, and then we have this lower bar for conviction. And all of these things kind of conspire together to make it easier to put people in prison for longer periods of time. And it sort of affects the entire process, like the plea bargaining process as well as the trial process, because the DAs may be less willing to make a deal, or at least an attractive deal, to a defendant to serve potentially less time. And then if they do go to trial, they have this lower bar for conviction. And then there's all these other sort of laws they can stack up to force a defendant to serve more time. We highlighted a few specific stories in this larger story about people who had been, two people in particular, who had been convicted in one in Caddo Parish and one in St. Tammany Parish, both convicted by non-unanimous juries, that is, juries where at least one member was not persuaded of the person's guilt. And they were both charged with aggravated flight, that is, running away from the police when the police were trying to stop them. In the case in St. Tammany, the guy had only gone about 300 feet or so before he stopped. But in any event, and I'm not necessarily minimizing what these people did, but they were both eventually got a life without parole sentence out of this because they had certain prior offenses. And so you can end up doing a life sentence here without having necessarily a violent record, depending on your background. And another thing I wanted to mention related to that is that we, along with leading the nation in our incarceration rate, we lead the nation by far in terms of the number of people serving life without parole. We have, on a per capita basis, twice as many as the number 2 state, which is Mississippi. And we also have long sentences for nonviolent offenders. I mean, that's one reason why our jails are so filled, our prisons. Right. When they did these series of criminal justice reforms last year, there was, one of the things that the Pew Center, which did a lot of research for Louisiana, found was that we were much more punitive to nonviolent offenders than a lot of peer states that tend to have similarly punitive sentences for violent crimes. So there's some of that's been changed in the reforms, but that's certainly true. Like you said, some has been changed in the reforms because there was this focused effort over the past few years to create some criminal justice reforms. Now, one thing that is certainly moving around and moving through rather surprisingly to many is changing the number of jurors that have to either find
guilt or find someone innocent.
Correct. I've been a little surprised that this has actually seems to have gained traction, that this to make us, we're now one of 2 states that allows for 10-2 verdicts, and we would, under this proposal that's moving through the legislature right now, the voters would vote this fall probably on whether to change that. It's in the Louisiana Constitution, whether to change that to require unanimous verdicts, which would be a big change and would leave Oregon as the only state that doesn't do it this way. It's been interesting because there's been sort of a coalition of conservatives and liberals. Partly the conservatives have been swayed by these arguments that the founders of the nation, the framers, had this idea of jury unanimity as being a real protection against the abuses of the state. And that's sort of the conservative argument for this. And then on the other side, there's a lot of this law is kind of steeped in racism, or it was born in racism, and continues to play out in ways that are have disparate racial impacts today. And that's sort of a appealing argument to some more liberal members of the legislature.
This is J.P. Morrell's legislation, right?
Correct.
That went through the Senate. That it got through the Senate.
So it's been through the Senate, and it's been through a committee on the House that passed unanimously the other day. I think it was Tuesday, and it's now headed to the House floor.
It goes through the House.
Which passes to make it a proposed constitutional amendment
Right.
go on the ballot to be voted on.
It would just allow the voters to vote on it, so that's a whole other hurdle, and it has to pass the House with a 2/3 majority, which is not a certain thing.
But speaking of politics, though, whenever legislative races, one issue candidates respond to or voters respond to is crime, and no candidate wants his opponent saying that he voted to make sentences lighter,
right,
or to make it more difficult. And so it's always a major political issue.
Yeah, it always seems to go in one direction because no one ever gets punished for going harder on crime. But you can, we all remember the Willie Horton story and so on, and nobody wants to be. It takes more courage politically, I think, to go in the other direction.
So this remains to be argued in the House, to be debated in the House.
Right.
Any prospects? Any
I mean, I think it has a decent chance of passing from the reporting I've been doing. I don't think it's a sure thing by any means, but I think it may be pretty close, but I think it may pass.
Okay. All right. We'll see where that goes. Thanks a lot, Gordon. Kathy, over to you. And Mayor-elect Cantrell soon will become Mayor Cantrell. And some of the things that she's going to be dealing with, and she's got a lot on her plate, certainly we all know what to deal with, but it's some properties, city properties and state-owned property too, a very big one, that are empty, that are vacant, that aren't being used. So how is she going to tackle those? Right.
In an article for The Advocate, I took a look at some of those properties and looked back at also some successes of the current administration, I guess I should say, in getting some of those major pieces of real estate that have stubbornly resisted progress for a long time, and trying to get them back into commerce. Some of the things that we've seen happen, of course, under Mitch Landrieu's administration, not to say that he's been responsible for all of these necessarily, but of course we've seen the hospitals, the University Medical Center and the VA hospital, and what that did in Mid-City, and that, the huge development that has occurred there. He's got, we got a sneak peek this week at the new airport. Very big deal. How long have they been talking about a new airport? And so that's well underway. We have the World Trade Center project that was bogged down in litigation for so long. Finally looks like it's proceeding. And again, not necessarily because of Mayor Landrieu, but certainly with the city's cooperation on all of these things. What Mayor-elect Cantrell faces are some very stubborn problems that have plagued the city for some time. One being, for instance, Municipal Auditorium, which of course has sat empty and unused since Hurricane Katrina. It was seriously damaged, took a lot of flood water. And while there have been some various proposals for bringing it back, there are a lot of reasons why it has not happened. The city is still negotiating, in fact, over money from FEMA to do a cleanup of the property itself, let alone, that's all that has to happen before you think about redevelopment in some fashion. And then what are you going to do with that property? It's a very large building. It's something that would take a lot of investment to turn into something different. And at the moment, there are other entertainment venues and event centers, so it's not like it's in high demand.
And an even bigger building is the Charity Hospital. Big
Charity Hospital. The good news on that one, though, is that there have been, and this has been in the news recently, because an LSU group and the state sought they sought input from the Urban Land Institute which I think I talked about once before here, but the prospects are probably better than ever, finally, that something will happen with charity. Now, you know, one reason these things are happening is because the real estate market is simply a lot better than it has been in a long time. And it's, I mean, better than in decades in New Orleans. And so you're seeing a lot more interest from investors and developers in projects like this. And it took, you know, a few local real estate people to jump on charity. And of all the projects, of all the properties that, you know, are vacant still in the city, that one is probably the one that most people consider the highest priority, because it just affects, you know, a big piece of the city.
And it's so visible, it's right there in the center of the city.
And it's the transition between the new medical center and downtown. And if you really got Charity Hospital going as something again, you know, that's going to make a big difference.
Now, that's a state-owned building, right?
It's a state-owned building, yeah.
And
but
real quick, to touch on Six Flags, because we have to wrap up this segment soon.
Six Flags is still a problem, and it's hard to see a solution to it. It's in New Orleans East. It was developed as a, you know, a tourism entertainment project, and as someone pointed out in my story, you know, it's well removed from where the tourists are in New Orleans. And in addition, it's still got a lot of equipment standing there. It would probably cost a lot to take it down. You've also got the former Lake Forest Plaza shopping center in eastern New Orleans. Continues to be a difficult problem. What are you going to do with it? It's in private hands. The former CEO of the failed bank, First NBC Bank, is the leader of that group, and we don't know yet what's going to happen with that.
Okay. Well,
if anything.
Let's see what movement happens over these years. All right, thanks a lot, Kathy. Over to Kevin. Something else that was moved with the monuments, which left a fair number of people fairly unhappy about it, but and others who supported it certainly. But what's going to happen with them, and what does Cantrell's stand on this? So
there's two different things that that are an issue here. One is, what do we do with the actual statues that are kind of boxed up in a city property somewhere? Latoya Cantrell said in an interview with Gambit that she would work with some of the most vocal opponents to this, Frank Stewart, the businessman, the Monuments Group that really opposed this, and trying to figure out where would an appropriate place for these statues to go if they were to stay within Orleans Parish. One idea is to put the Beauregard statue in Greenwood Cemetery, which you know, in some ways makes sense. I wonder about Metairie Cemetery, because that's where Beauregard's actually buried. But then, you know, you got these very large statues. Robert E. Lee is over 16 feet tall, so you can't really fit them in museums. Mitch Landrieu had said that he was going to do an RFP where you could kind of maybe figure out a place for them with a museum, that kind of thing. That never happened. So that, and also the issue of what do you do with the places where the statues were removed? How do we put those back into a place where it shows that we care about public spaces in New Orleans?
Is there an official task force or a committee or something sort of discussing this, or just an ad hoc group?
Well, I think that's a kind of interesting question, because the group that ended up getting designated as the semi-official group that would at least start talking about that process kind of created their group in a vacuum. They started right after Lee came down in an independent process. They never went to the city, never said we want to do this process officially, and they got into the summer, had an event that got great turnout. They did a big event at the library in the fall, and they were just really impressed with how much interest there was in people coming out and trying to talk about what do we want to do with the places that are so important to us, especially Lee Circle, this, you know, center of Mardi Gras festivities. And as they got into the spring, and I think Mitch Landrieu realized, wow, we don't have a process in place. We haven't really come up with anything to replace it. Let's make them the official group. But I will caution to say that this group really sees themselves as laying the foundation. They're really seeing themselves as taking the input. Monuments, it can be a very, very contentious process. Once you get a design, it automatically becomes very controversial. You're always going to have a group that's not pleased with it. So I think they're going to have to take whatever this group is laying the foundation for and then move very carefully into finding the right person, the right architect, the right design that would reflect some of those examples, but also, you know, show how important these public spaces are to New Orleans.
As you say, it can be controversial. It's controversy on top of what's already been controversial. So as far as Mayor-elect Cantrell is concerned, in terms of process, any idea what she's going to do as a process? Do we know?
For replacement?
Yeah.
She has said that she's okay with what's going forward now. The question that I'm just going to be asking as a reporter is, what's step two? This group is doing a great job at listening, but at some point, too many cooks spoil the soup, right? And you're going to need somebody to take charge of this process
And make a
say,
decision.
Absolutely.
And make some decisions. Okay. All right. Well, that's one certainly we'll be watching, I'm sure, for a while to come. All righty. Errol, over to you. And you talked about our city of Oaks and now our Pelicans flying over to Oakland. But, you know, it's wonderful that they're in it, you know?
Well, almost unbelievable. You know, Tennessee Williams once said that there are three great cities in the United States: New Orleans, San Francisco, and New York, and all the rest are Cleveland. Now we have the situation where New Orleans and San Francisco, in effect, are playing each other, and conceivably the winner might wind up playing Cleveland, okay, in the finals. The Pelicans have gotten, you know, much further than anybody realized, and they're playing the defending world's champs. They've won the World Championship 2 of the last 3 years, but the team that we saw with New Orleans on their chest this last week was a very good team. I mean, they played some basketball like we never saw before, so we don't even know what the full potential is. Maybe there's a surprise there, but if they win a couple of games or if they win the series, let's say New Orleans, the city and the franchise, really needs this badly. If you read some of the out-of-town reports, I was reading today a national basketball website, and the New Orleans franchise is one that's really sort of like looked down upon, as one that no one pays attention to. There was one that criticized the press coverage, that there's hardly really any press corps that covers the Pelicans, whereas the other franchises have a lot of people that follow it. And so we really need this kind of win. We really need to have something that's going to draw interest in the franchise and sell season tickets and then in future years. And so it means a lot. It means a lot economically. And, you know, they put on a good show. They're in a good location. I mean, being located right down there in downtown New Orleans, and now that they're developing the whole sports district. And we have Anthony Davis, thank goodness, which is
it's exciting.
Well, which is really a godsend, like one of the greatest basketball players that there is today. And I think for now, I think people are becoming familiar with the other players on the team. Over the last few years, they may not even know who the players were, other than there was always one big name like Chris Paul or somebody. But now people can talk about Drew Holiday and the other players. So, yeah, we really need this. And they probably don't need to go all the way, and they probably won't go all the way to prove themselves as a city. But a game or two against the Warriors, I think, would mean a lot. And one big, I think, encouraging bit of news was that the coach, Alvin Gentry, his contract was renewed this year. A few months ago, there was talk about him not being back. They were booing him in the arena. And now he's gotten that endorsement. And Gentry, when he was hired, was an assistant coach for the Warriors. And he and Steve Curry, the coach there, are kind of like friends, and they've been kind of trash talking each other all week in a friendly sort of way. But it's an important series.
Well, certainly no problem in selling tickets right now. That's for sure. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. And especially against the Warriors. You know what the problem has always been? First of all, New Orleans is one of the smallest cities in the NBA. I think the only one with a smaller population is Salt Lake City, and then Memphis. Every other place is, even Oklahoma City is a lot bigger than New Orleans is, and so we're a smaller city. We have an NFL franchise. We really have an embarrassment of riches in terms of professional franchises, and there's a lot to do in New Orleans. But when you have a not so well-known team playing a weeknight like during the winter, it's hard to sell.
Right.
When you got the Lakers or the Celtics on weekends, it's different, you know.
There's a lot of games, and they're not cheap, and it's hard to fill up. I mean, there's 8 home games for the Saints a year, you know, but there's 40.
It stretches
41.
the corporate support too, because you know a lot of the corporate support around New Orleans goes to the Saints and suites and purchasing suites and all of that stuff. It's tough in a smaller market like this.
Certainly tomorrow.
Yeah, the regular season is 41 home games.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult. Both they have a pretty good sponsorship package and a good TV package, and that helps. And fortunately, a little bit of a tourist base too, that helps sell tickets. But it's difficult.
Tomorrow, the first game against the Golden State Warriors. Right?
Tomorrow night, 9:30.
All right, we wish them all the luck. All righty, back over to Gordon right now. And we have heard some talk about who is going to be in LaToya Cantrell's administration. One name that was floated out there regarding Homeland Security was former police chief.
Yeah, a little bit of a surprise this week. Warren Riley, the former police chief, for background people, if people have forgotten, Warren Riley, he was the police chief from shortly after Katrina in 2005 until the end of Mayor Ray Nagin's second term in 2010. He was promoted shortly after Nagin essentially fired Eddie Compass within a month or so after the storm. You know, this was a little bit of a, we had started hearing his name maybe 6 weeks ago, but I called Warren Riley at the time, and he said there was nothing to it. But his name started percolating again more recently, and I called him the other day, and he said that he was in some talks with the administration, and then Travers Mackel was able to get LaToya Cantrell to confirm that he was a leading contender for the job. It's a little bit of a surprise in that his tenure was pretty controversial as police chief. He's now being considered, I should say, for a department for heading the Homeland Security Department, which is technically over the police chief, although historically the police chief hasn't had a lot of oversight from that person. But that might change if we were to have a former police chief in that position. And LaToya Cantrell has indicated she plans to keep the current police chief, Michael Harrison, on, but not necessarily for the long run. She hasn't said that she won't keep him on for the long run. So anyway, back to Riley, he's a little bit of a surprise in that his term was fairly controversial, I would say, and he didn't seem to inspire a lot of love across the community. I mean, I got a lot of calls as we were writing this story from people on kind of both ends of the political spectrum who were, I would say, shocked and a little bit appalled by
Why are people shocked and appalled?
He didn't seem to get along well with, you know, the people who are more the conservatives who are very pro-law and order, just never really liked him, never thought he listened to them, didn't think he was a great police chief. There was a lot of cliques. There's always been a lot of cliques in the NOPD, and the feeling was that there was this flourished under him and certain people got punished and others didn't. But I mean, the biggest single critique was that the police department, you know, had this terrible breakdown after Hurricane Katrina, and that he didn't do a great job. The police department, led by him, did not do a good job of trying to reckon with what had happened, and really tried to sort of just move on and look the other way. And it took these major federal investigations to turn up what really happened. And you know, the chief, Riley, was, you know, spectacularly incurious about it himself, and admitted that he hadn't read the police report into the Danziger Bridge incident. And which, you know, our reporters, I was at the Times-Picayune then, and our reporters did a big story on, you know, years before anyone was charged, about all the major holes in this investigation, witnesses that seemed to be made up and things like that. I mean, it was something that the chief probably should have read.
It's an important report.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll see where that moves along, but she did name a few folks for her administration this week.
Yeah, she named a chief administrative officer who she's going to bring in, somebody from out of town, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, a young guy who's known to be pretty ambitious there, and we've been kind of looking at his record there, but you know, haven't really turned up anything glaring that would cause a controversy like Riley. She's also named a chief of staff, which was no surprise because he was a staffer for her a long time in the council office and led the transition, John Fusho. And then she also named Bo Tidwell, who's now does communications for the NOPD as her communications director. One of the things I thought that was interesting about those three names is that it's still not clear to me who is your person that's really kind of your strategy. You know, Mitch Landrieu had a Ryan Burney. He had a guy that really looked at communications from what's the long game here. And you also need somebody who's kind of an enforcer, who's somebody who is going to go in and you know, crack the whip when you get your staffers who are infighting. They can kind of go settle that. Or if somebody did something wrong, you can kind of go in and say, you know, that shouldn't have been done that way. Of those three names, none of them really jump out at me as being somebody that's as familiar with New Orleans as they could be, and then also doing that strategic effort going forward. So we're going to continue to look at that pretty closely.
And there are a lot more names that have to be forthcoming too, a lot more positions. And before, well, May 7th is when she's, right, inaugurated,
yeah,
May
so
7th, so there's a lot of folks there that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, that's going to be probably coming up this week and into next week.
All right, thanks a lot, Kevin. Kathy, over to you. Formosa plant, chemical plant, said they're going to be locating in St. James.
Right, and this is a huge deal. I mean, it's a huge plant for one thing, a $9.4 billion plant by Formosa, this company out of Taiwan, which already operates 3 other plants in the area, in the Baton Rouge area and in Pointe-Coupee Parish. This would be the largest plant, and it's a huge development. It's a chemical plant, and obviously up and down the river, we're used to these stories, you know, about new plant developments, especially since in the past, I'd say 5 years or so, there's been such a boom in this kind of industrial development all along the lower Mississippi River. And Louisiana has, you know, a lot of new plants and a lot of expansions that are already underway. Some are still on the you know, being proposed. Over in Lake Charles is really a hotbed of them. But between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, it's really heated up. And this is a plant that promises to employ eventually 1,200 people. That's really a lot for us, because some of these plants don't, you know, they're automated largely, and they don't necessarily employ that many people. So 1,200 is really quite a few people.
Especially in a parish without a very large population.
This is going to be an explosion in St. James Parish.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's a very big deal. And meanwhile, you know, the development will happen over about a 10-year period, and they expect to employ at their peak 8,000 construction workers. So just think of that influx.
$9.4 billion plant.
Yes.
That's
yes.
the big plant.
So it's a huge deal, and you know, certainly for that part of the region. And you know, there obviously would be spin-off benefits all around the area, including in New Orleans. But housing is going to go crazy in that area. We're going to see a lot of, you know, a big rush for housing, assuming this all goes through. And I was at a conference this morning where this was being discussed, and the general feeling was that this is a go, that this will happen. It's been in the works for a long time, and so I don't think we'll see them back off of this one.
Okay, all right, Kathy, thanks. It's time to look ahead. E.
Well, Kansas City Southern has historically been a big freight carrier in and out of New Orleans. Hasn't been very active since Katrina, and now next month it's bringing back what it calls its intermodal service, which combines containerization with trucks and trains and everything else. Will be service between New Orleans and Dallas at its beginning. So it's good to see the Kansas City Southern name back in the city.
Indeed it is. Thanks, Harold. Gordon.
Well, I'm going to go back to basketball and say I can't quite predict the Pelicans' victory, but I think they'll give the Warriors all they can handle. I see it going 7 games, and I think the Pelicans have a real shot.
Oh, I hope so, too. They've been playing some really ferocious basketball, quite aggressive there. Kathy?
Yeah, back on the projects I was mentioning, one that I didn't mention before is the Naval Support Activity Facility, also known as the Port of Embarkation, down in the Bywater area near the river. And that's one of the projects. I think we may hear something about that soon, because there's been a feasibility study underway. It's set to be completed in May, and I think we'll be hearing more about the prospects there.
Okay, that's exciting. Kevin?
Well, you mentioned that this is May 7th is next Monday will be the inauguration. So look for next week to kind of be a victory lap for Mitch Landrieu. I think he's going to be talking a lot about what Kathy talked about earlier and what they've accomplished to rebuild the city after Katrina during his term. And then City Council also has their last meeting on Thursday, and so you'll be hearing a lot of them trying to wrap up their term and take credit for some things.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. We're wrapping it up here, and thank you all for joining us. And of course, you know, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod & Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.